I'm LaToya Gray Sparks. I am a community outreach coordinator at the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. We call it DHR. I see some of my wonderful colleagues in the audience, so thank you so much for coming here. I really appreciate you. Just a little introduction about DHR. We are the state's Historic Preservation Office. We've been around for quite some time. Some of our most popular programs are historic marker programs. Those tend to be, that is a very popular program, but there are other services and programs that we provide that you will hopefully learn more about during this presentation. As Community Outreach Coordinator, and this is a fairly new position that was created, I'm responsible for working to support and reach out to communities that have been underrepresented in Virginia's historic narrative. And I think my introduction to historic preservation and the career path that I'm on now is, in many ways, it was inspired by the Moon Sisters. I had an opportunity to be a cartographer for them when they were just beginning. And so it is an honor to be here today and just see all of the progress that they've made so far. And all of us are gathered here because of it. So that's enough with my intro. So what I'm going to be doing, I think, sorry. So I'm assuming most of y'all have seen the exhibit already on Jackson Ward. It's amazing. I think the Moon Sisters and the LVA team have done a wonderful job of documenting, cataloging, and interpreting just the history of Jackson Ward, its richness, but also the devastation that urban renewal has had on that community. And I wish that I could say that it was just that one incident and that was it. But unfortunately, that's not the case. I found in my research, and it was very daunting at times, that the period between the 1930s and 50s, which led to the construction of the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike, was just the beginning of what would be a decades-long period of targeting and erasing and destroying every single, or impacting in some way, every single African-American enclave that existed here in Richmond. And I think when I say that it was daunting, I just could not believe just the amount of devastation, the succession of projects. That's an example of what was happening to Carver in the 1950s, but it was back to back. There was constantly some kind of development happening in this city, and it was always the same group of people, the same geographies that were targeted in the name of redevelopment and renewal for the entire city. But there were people who lost their homes, their institutions, their businesses, their network, their connectivity. And this has been something that's happened just over and over again. It's like an assault. And I pray that I can do some justice for what those people suffered, but it's devastating and just mind-boggling, just the amount of destruction that was purposefully and meticulously planned and carried out. So I created a timeline of some of the big urban renewal projects that occurred within the city. This is in no way exhaustive at all. Arguably, we are still going through phases of urban renewal. If you're not from Richmond, there was a comprehensive plan that was adopted. It's called Richmond 300. I had the honor of serving on the advisory council for Richmond 300, so I helped with the 3-year community engagement component. And I didn't have any experience in urban planning, didn't know anything about it, thought that it was a boring profession, why do we need plans, But it was during that time that I learned more about, there were some questions that we were asked, why do we have certain pockets of poverty concentrated in certain areas? Some of the other questions that were asked, I grew up in the south side of Richmond, in the part that was annexed, so added during the 1970s to dilute the rising Black power, political power that was happening in this city. And I often felt as a little girl as if I was living in what the late Dr. John Meeser said was a separate city, like a part of Richmond, but not really a part of it. And I could see the differences, like when my parents and I would visit my grandparents on the other side of the Nickel Bridge in the West End, and just seeing like these stark differences between where I grew up, what I was exposed to, and how not everyone in the city lived that way, but I couldn't figure out why that was the case. And it wasn't until participating in this planning program on the advisory council that I was introduced to the redlining maps, and I'm sure Dr. Fenn covered. Harlan Bartholomew, who I will talk about soon in this presentation, and just the many plans and interventions that were orchestrated throughout the city in a way that was discriminate and in a way that kind of kept our communities separate and unequal. So in my research, there were some, like I said before, there's this cycle every decade or so. There's a new plan or project, and so I came up with what I would call like the anatomy of erasure, maybe the pattern of erasure. So it starts with, like if we look at what Harlan Bartholomew was doing when he was hired by the city of Richmond in the 1930s, he was doing a lot of documentation. So surveying, mapping places. A lot of the maps that were created by his firm were targeting exactly where the colored population existed in Richmond. So they had to be identified. And so there are all these extensive maps and reports that were used to carry that out. Then there would be what I would call devaluation. I mean, I like alliteration, so these are all Ds, and I'm just using the best words I can. But devaluation, so like assessments of properties, property evaluations. I think of the redlining map, that wasn't necessarily created by a planner, but as you'll see in a few slides or so, like there's definitely some communication between the cartographers or the makers of those maps. They're communicating, talking to each other, building on the work of their predecessor. And then that was an opportunity, I guess, to identify, and this is one of the first maps I ever made when I learned how to make maps. But what I did was I took that bottom layer, this map right here, that map where all of, it's representative, well, this is the location of where African Americans lived in Richmond. And then if you just take the layers of the redlining map, you can see like, and the red are the darkened spots, and that's where African Americans lived in the city. And then there's a period of disinvestment. And this is complicated. So there are times in which the city would deny certain communities access to assets that other parts of the city had. An example I can think about is the Westwood community, which is in the West End near the University of Richmond. It's one of the few historic African American communities, and we've had the honor of working with that neighborhood over the past few years or so, but they were able to remain intact and not be displaced, but they were cut off from services like sewage or water infrastructure. So there was like a well like in the middle of the community, and that's where the people would get their water. And that was done on purpose, I think, to drive them out of the area, and thankfully that was not successful. But it's just that's a blatant example, I think, of purposeful disinvestment, to scare people off or make them relocate to somewhere else. And then there's the destruction, and a lot of that, of course, is covered in the exhibit here at the library. So, Harlan Bartholomew. All of this planning and development didn't happen overnight. It takes planners. It takes someone who was an architect of destruction to lay the foundation and the footprint or the blueprint for planning, like not only in Richmond, but across the city. So this is Harlan Bartholomew. He was a civil engineer by trade, but somehow became the dean of urban planning. He was hired throughout the country to work on comprehensive plans in many cities, metropolitan areas. Like if the infrastructure or the environment looks familiar, that's probably because it is established in work that he did years ago. He was hired, so Richmond, because we're in Virginia and we do the Virginia way, like the language that's used like in plans or whatnot for Harlan Bartholomew are not as explicit as why he was hired, but this is a good example of what Louisville, Kentucky was hiring him for, and that was to solve the Negro problem. There were many communities that were anxious, worried about a growing African American population. So you'll find that when Harlan Bartholomew was beginning his work in the 1930s, you're getting like a lot of Jim Crow ordinances and laws that control where African Americans can go or live in a city. And so all of this is happening during this time, and he is hired to essentially survey, create plans and recommendations for keeping people constrained, Black people constrained. And so I believe that a lot of the geographic boundaries that we are operating in today in Richmond are based on plans that were created in the 1930s by this man. Okay, so for you map lovers out there, we're gonna get a little bit nerdy, because I love maps, now I do. I think maps provide an insight into landscapes like as they existed before. I love the Library of Virginia and the people here because they've been very helpful and encouraging to me as far as like finding resources that are cartographic and then using those to interpret like what the history of a space was and how it's changed over time. So I use these maps because they are, it's a series of them, and they're by different stakeholders. So you have this one by the Virginia Department of Public Works. This was created in the 1930s. The red areas are where African Americans resided in the city. Then you have these two maps that were created by Bartholomew and Associates. They show the distribution of the Black population in 1934. Then the types of housing areas, and the darker areas equal homes that are obsolete or were labeled as obsolete, and then therefore could be designated as slums that would then be ripe for slum clearance. But you can just see like there's this progression, this building upon of geography and this hyper focus on where African Americans lived in this city. Here's another one. So this one is from the Richmond Times-Dispatch, and it just gets straight to the point. So you have like these darkened spaces, and these are what are considered, and sorry about the quality of the map, but pretty much like where slums and blight exist in the city. So they're using, and this is based on the planning maps that were created by Harlan Bartholomew. These are later maps from a 1950s plan. There was a firm from Ohio that was hired to build upon the work that Bartholomew had started, and they were starting to look at where to map the expressway in the city. So again, they were basing their work on work that was done before, not necessarily engaging with the communities, by the way, and like I said, they're from Ohio, so they're not from here, but they are using or informed by what Bartholomew set in, or established in his plans. So again, the blighted residential areas, the recommended expressway system. And this is a brief paragraph, but I was blown away when I read it because I'm like, holy crap, this is very interesting. So this is from the 1950s plan, and it's about historical buildings and landmarks in Richmond. And I'll just read it out loud. Of special significance in Richmond, in the planning of traffic ways, is the unusually large number of historical buildings and sites which must not be destroyed by street openings or widenings. Many of these are of national interest. Fortunately, there was available a recent tabulation and classification of such places prepared by a committee of the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities, which is Preservation Virginia Now, if you know of that nonprofit, and that will serve as a guide in the present study. Every effort has been made in the routing of proposed traffic ways to avoid disturbing any of these places. Now, for the longest time, I couldn't figure out exactly, I couldn't find the survey that they were referring to, but I could just guess which neighborhoods may have gotten that preferential treatment and which ones did not get that. But as preservationists, we often tell people that, okay, just because your home is listed as historic or is considered to be a landmark, that does not necessarily protect it from demolition or destruction. But there are some people who are using preservation as a tool to save their neighborhoods, but not everyone had access to that as a tool. So one of the examples that I want to raise, so there were, so you saw that, there were organizations or communities that were able to utilize historic preservation. Well, then there were some groups that, or African American communities and stakeholders who realized, like, well, maybe this is something that we can try, maybe we can use preservation as a way of preserving our space. And so this is where the archives from DHR come into play. If you've never visited our office, please do. We love having visitors. We have an amazing collection of archives. Some of it I'm still discovering, as well as my colleagues, but it is full of a wealth of information because we've done a lot of surveys across the state over for a while now. So if you're ever interested in learning more about the historic geography of a space or wanting to know more about what a landscape may have looked like in the past, you may want to check us out. There are files that we keep for certain locations, and in those files we have newspaper clippings, old newspaper clippings. I was just talking to someone not too long ago about everything is digitized now, which is great, but if you don't know what you're looking for in a collection, it may be hard to find that information. So that's when visiting the archives, reading the correspondence that may have been exchanged over a location, and or seeing the articles that are clipped deliberately because they are talking about the zeitgeist of the time or the issues and the challenges of a historic preservation listing. So I would just highly encourage y'all to visit, reach out to us. We have an amazing team who's willing to provide information if you're interested. And we have a lot of old maps as well, which I love, and I think helps to provide insight into a place. So Fifth Street Baptist Church is one of those places that I learned about through our archives. It was a church established in 1866. The building itself was constructed in 1926. It was located at 5th and Jackson Street in Navy Hill. And it was a building, or the church itself survived the devastation of the construction of the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike. It was a miracle, but they survived that. And so they were seeking ways to preserve, the congregation was seeking ways to preserve that church when there was talk about the Coliseum being built in the downtown area. So I'll get to the correspondence, but as I said, there were some buildings that were saved or were not ravaged necessarily by the construction of the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike, but that did not necessarily save the adjacent communities and structures nearby. So this is an example of resources I actually found here at the Library of Virginia. These are images from a Coliseum real estate brochure. So again, there's the documentation, the surveying, the collection of information about parcels of property that resided where the Coliseum now exists. And this is just a snippet from that. So there's the cover page, there are the architectural drawings of the place, who are the owners. It even gets into details of how much their buildings were, or those sites were worth. So there was a value placed on them, but clearly not as much value as the buildings that were below Broad Street, which is where predominantly white businesses and residences existed. So I thought this was interesting because this is kind of a lookbook of some sort, or if you're going out buying property as an investor or a developer, and just, these beautiful buildings and structures that look like they have integrity, and none of them are around anymore. They've been replaced by a Coliseum that we are in the process of, again, eventually demolishing, so kind of starting that all over again. But this is an example, I think, of what you can find in the archives if you're looking. And so back to Fifth Street Baptist Church, there was an expansion proposed. for downtown Richmond that would include the building of the Coliseum and eventually the expansion of the space that would gobble up that church. If you look at the correspondence in our records, you can see like these desperate attempts like to have our historic board of resources declare the site as significant historically, and they almost got there. Like we had, the office has signed off and saying like, congratulations, this is considered to be a historic landmark. You should continue on with the process, but it wasn't fast enough, or it wasn't enough, unfortunately. And so the building was demolished, and I'm not sure if it's going to play, and that's what's there now, where that church once existed. So for the sake of time, I'm going to go over one more example. This is from the Fulton files that we have in our office, and I call this the last houses on Denny Street. So Fulton, developed in the 1800s. It was a residential area for workers employed in tobacco factory shipyards, railroads, an ideal and strategic location for commerce and labor. During Jim Crow, it became a very tight-knit African-American community. And it was one of the last African-American neighborhoods to be targeted by urban renewal. So by this time, and this is in the 1970s, we've had the decimation of Jackson Ward, of Newtown and Carver, Randolph, that's where my family grew up in the near West End. And so people were apprehensive when they found planners walking through the Fulton neighborhood, documenting, surveying, knocking on doors, gathering information because they knew what would probably be coming. And so there were fights, there was resistance, and then this person that I have featured in this, or who's featured in this picture, is Spencer Armstead. He's a lifelong Fultonite, I think that's what they're called, but he grew up, lived in Fulton, that was his home. He was trying to protect the home that his parents owned. He had all of these deed records that showed like just the roots of ownership, black ownership in this space. And he was battling against the Richmond Housing Authority, which was gobbling up properties through the use of eminent domain. And so there is a lot of correspondence between Mr. Armstead and our office as far as getting historic Fulton declared as a historic landmark, or at least the last houses, because there was a lot of demolition by the time I think he was engaging with DHR, but he was trying to save like just a sliver of his former neighborhood. So here is a block from 700 Denny Street. And unfortunately, despite all of the promotion Mr. Armstead had, he was reaching out to President George H.W. Bush, and telling him about the importance of this neighborhood. He had interviews through CNN, just so much work, so much energy going into this. And this is one of those archival materials where it's heartbreaking because you know like the end of the story. You're still rooting for him, I was, but you just know that it does not end well. And so these are the last homes, one of them that belonged to Mr. Armstead. They were acquired by RRHA. All right, so look at this. This is what they looked like initially. And then they were left to just languish and be vacant, to the point where you get to something called demolition by neglect, where the integrity of the building is so bad that it has to be demolished. It has to be destroyed because that's a more cost-effective way of dealing with the property. I'm not sure, I might be telling my age here, but there's something called like the broken windows theory. I'm someone who wanted to be once upon a time a prosecutor, so you learn like, okay, broken windows, like if there's one broken window, at least the theory is, there's one broken window in a structure, then eventually that blight and that brokenness will expand to a neighborhood and impact it. But what happens when it's the government that's involved in that, like creating the broken windows, you know? And that's what happened here. And when my coworkers and I came across this, it was just shocking because it's so blatant. Like the windows have been removed. They've been boarded up. The places were allowed to sit for a long time. There was some scathing letters that Mr. Armstead was writing to the Richmond Redevelopment Housing Authority because they were just sitting on the property and not even, in an efficient way, in a swift way, like redeveloping. And it was just, heartbreaking. Like, what was the point of this? And so you see, there's a suit. He tried to sue to prevent the demolition of the structures. That sadly did not happen. And I neglected to put a picture in here, but it's just like a landfill. At least the space itself is like just a landfill. There's nothing there. So sadly, yeah. So that unfortunately did not last, or it did not survive. And I included like a little blurb because there was a developer who built in Fulton, but where the buildings or where the new developments were built, they weren't in the original Fulton space. So you have all of this vacant land that's not been developed on, and of course people are upset. They want to go back to their space, their homes, or just get reestablished. And that was not happening. And there was a developer who couldn't understand, Thomas Bradford. He was a project manager for the Richmond Redevelopment Housing Authority. People just don't realize, because it's not in Fulton, or it's not what they think of Fulton, it's east of Government Road up Fulton Hill. And so, the development has been complete. Like, what are you complaining about? And I think there are a lot of letters, correspondence, articles like that, where there's just this uncaring and crassness in which people treat certain spaces and the people who live in those spaces, and it's very heartbreaking and infuriating at the same time. Okay, so that's a little depressing. I want to at least end on something that's a little bit of an update, or an upbeat story. So there are times when preservation can be successful. And this is a great example of this. So this is about the Hickory Hill Community Center in the South Side. Now, this area wasn't necessarily impacted by urban renewal, but it was impacted by annexation. And from just talking to people and researching, there are a lot of people who are impacted by displacement on the other side of the river who then moved to the south side to get reestablished. I grew up in the south side of Richmond, and I didn't realize, I understood that I lived in a separate city, but I didn't realize how separate it was. So the area of the south side that I lived in was heavily industrialized. A lot of heat islands. There are numerous interactive maps that have been created to reflect that reality. The infrastructure, as far as for biking and walking, just walking is not there. It's just, there are improvements that are being made, but there's a long way to go. I had no idea, my friends and I, when we were little, were pretty much taking our lives into our hands when we were walking around, just playing outside and not realizing just, how unprotected we were. I've lost track of the number of classmates, childhood friends who died from gun violence because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time where I live or grew up. And there are a lot of my friends who also died prematurely because of health ailments that come from living in a place without a lot of green space, that's near tobacco factories, and just the list goes on and on. No easy access or walkable access to a grocery store. So there's all that. When Richmond 300 was passed, one of the big initiatives that we were excited about is that everyone in the city should be within 5 to 10 minutes walking distance of a park. There are not a lot of public green spaces in this part of the South Side, so it came as a shock when firefighters and other city officials were proposing that the one public green space at this community center be paved over, to create a fire burn unit, so more toxins being introduced into an already toxic environment. But then also just the thought of taking away a community center that a lot of Black and brown kids, that is their refuge. I remember being at this rec center when I was little. It was a great place to be, just to play, and in an otherwise sparse, or where that's a scarcity. But anyway, so in 2023, there was a training facility that was proposed for the area. A lot of community members were upset. And when I initially got engaged with this, I was still a grad student studying urban planning, and so my response to them was like, get involved with the process. Like, the earlier you are involved, the better. You know, there's a way to stop this, because often when you hear about a big development, like by the time you hear about it, it's too late. Like, the plans have already been made, the drawings have already been created and whatnot, so it's kind of like you're tokenized as far as your involvement. So anyway, these people showed up to meetings. Sometimes they had meetings that were canceled, just out of the blue. Sometimes they show up like, 6 o'clock at night to like protest or say something, only to be turned away because the planning commissioner members were spending their 2 hours talking and didn't have time for public input. So these people were doing everything right to protest what they thought was an obnoxious and like a poor use of a property, of a parcel of land that belonged to the community. And so when it wasn't working at the local level, they actually reached out to our office to apply to see if the community center could be recognized as a historic landmark. And I'm so happy to share that, yes, it was approved. I think back in 2024. Forgive me, time like is just meshing together. But they were able to get a state historic landmark recognition through our office. I think they're working on getting placed on the National Register. And they also have a highway marker, and this is a picture from that event. It was wonderful. A resolution from the city recognizing the importance of that space. It was a Rosenwald school. I forgot to mention that, which is a big deal because those are very rare resources. And to have one in Richmond is amazing. So there are opportunities, I think, for people to use preservation as a tool. Will it solve everything? I don't know. But I am encouraged by the number of people that I've met who are, they're not waiting for someone in government to help them. Like, they're just doing the work, and there are a lot of good people in here who are doing just that. So I guess I will end with that, and I have a call to action. Like, if you have not checked out the City of Richmond's Cultural Heritage Stewardship Plan, I would recommend that you do so. It is an opportunity to, one, get involved, but yeah, just to, it's a tool that can be used to advocate for underrepresented sites, communities. I think that preservation, if done in a creative way, can help people stay in place as well. I know there are a lot of concerns about displacement, and so I think there are ways that we can be creative and use preservation to ensure that we don't have another exhibit like this 50 years from now talking about where did we go wrong or why were people displaced, and yeah, that's it. So thank you so much for your time, for listening to me. I hope that was good. So, yeah. So, any questions, reactions?
Thank you. This was a great kind of stroll down memory lane. I remember the Fulton project, the fight with Armstead, whatever happened to him, number one, and it's listening to many of the talks today around the same subject. I remember there's in Vinegar Hill in Charlottesville, there was a big fight. People are still bitter about that. I lived in the Randolph area. I remember sitting in an area on my front porch a little bit west of where the demolition was actively going on, and seeing these armies of rats just marching down the street towards the paddle pond at Bird Park. I mean, in the evening after work. Yeah. I mean, and so I wonder, when these projects happen, is it just about your 4 stages? Or are there plans being made to help the displaced people, to get rid of the rodent, all of that stuff? Is it a kind of a holistic, usually, approach or not?
That's a great question. I would say, like, historically, not holistic at all, unfortunately. I think often people were considered to be an afterthought. So you get these projects and these proposed, one, there's the units that are being demolished, and often the units that were built to replace the ones that had been demolished were never enough to make up for the households that were displaced. I think that this cultural stewardship plan can help like with being a little bit more holistic, like realizing that, it's not just buildings that we're preserving and building, like we're communities. Communities are made of people. And so I think that there is a shift in planning, but it's slow, but just to make sure there is a more holistic, people-centered approach. Yeah, thank you.
So thank you again for this. I'm a new immigrant to Richmond, so all of this is new to me. When I moved here a little over 2 years ago, so let me just back up. A lot of what we've heard, of course, is not new history. The fact that the federal government and that cities wanted to wipe away what they termed, problem neighborhoods. That's been pretty well documented.
Yeah.
But it surprised me moving here 2 years ago to be reading about institutions that you would think would be standing up for neighborhoods and neighborhood preservation,
Yeah.
and actually not standing up for landmark buildings like, what is it, the Richmond Community Hospital that the university
Yeah.
decided was not significant. And so I think we really need to hold cities and the federal government accountable, but there are institutions in the city that obviously have a block against what they should be doing as well. And I don't know if it's more a comment than a
Yeah,
question.
thank you. And stay tuned for the next panel because they're going to be talking about that project. But yes, it's a good observation. Like, it's not just government actors, but there are other actors as well that do that.
Hi, LaToya.
Hi, Riley.
Just want to say once again, I think this is maybe the third or fourth presentation of yours that I've gone to, and you've wowed me once again in finding new images and new maps that I haven't seen before, and you know that I'm in the trenches trying to find this stuff, so thank you again for bringing new stuff to light that I don't think a lot of us have seen yet. It's awesome to see it in progress.
Thank you.
My question is about eminent domain, which is something that I'm starting to look into more.
Yeah.
Do we have documents and archives on eminent domain, and how detailed are there? Are we able to determine how much or how little, maybe is a better way of putting it, people were getting compensated for their properties, and who holds that if those records do exist?
Is a very good question. I guess I will say, as far as documentation, sorry, I just had a thought and it left me. I guess I share like those archives that I came across for the Coliseum structures. Those are pretty in depth, and they provide like a dollar amount of what was offered for structures. So I think there are all kinds of archival resources that you can look at. I would start with the Richmond Redevelopment Housing Authority, but if that doesn't work, then there is a commission that is examining the impact that colleges and universities have had when it comes to using eminent domain to gobble up properties. Christopher Newport University with Shoe Hill, forgive me if I'm getting the neighborhood, but that's a great recent example of just eminent domain being used as late as like the 2000s to deprive people, to take property from people. So I think there's definitely an effort to gather that information. I didn't get to share this in this presentation, but there were legal notices that I came across in the Richmond Times-Dispatch in the 1950s that provide insight into when the Richmond Redevelopment Housing Authority was using eminent domain to essentially compel people to court who were behind in their taxes. And sometimes the amount was like $100, or what would be like $100 today. But that was all that was needed to trigger this process that once it started, it is very hard to stop. So I think maybe legal notices posted in the paper, because those have to be publicized to let the parties know that they're supposed to show up to court. But I guess I would start there. If I think of anything else, I will pass it on to you. But there definitely is now an interest in that, which I think is fascinating. So hopefully we can get a hold of those records. So that's a good question.
Hi.
Hi, Robin.
Oh, me. Okay. Hey.
Oh, hi.
That was great. Thank you so much. And I just have a question, and I'm not sure, like, if this is off the mark, but I was just kind of thinking, what role does gentrification play in all of this? And I'm thinking maybe more currently, because we know neighborhoods are changing very rapidly in Richmond because of gentrification. And I don't know really what I'm asking, but I just like, what role does that play in this narrative or this story?
Well, I think there are some scholars who would argue that gentrification, as we're seeing it, is like the new wave of urban renewal. There's a professor at, gosh darn it, I think he might be an American university, but he was studying, I guess, neighborhood changes in DC. Oh gosh darn it, I forget what he was calling something. But anyway, I think his name is Derek, but he's been helpful. He's been working with a few communities in Northern Virginia as they draft their plans and, take into account like how urban renewal impacted communities, but how that is still happening today, like through gentrification. So I will look that source up to you and give it to you. But I guess it builds on like just the valuation of property. I briefly was a real estate agent like a few years ago. I was having a midlife crisis and not knowing what I wanted to do with my life. So I wasn't a very good one, but I was introduced to like the landscape in Richmond, and I noticed several homes, like specifically in the north side and parts of Randolph and the south side, where there were these foreclosures that were happening that were linked to like the bad housing crisis that we had years ago, that there might be arguably another housing bubble. But I noticed that back then, and this is like 10 years ago, where investors were gobbling up properties super low because they were devalued so much, and then flipping them and increasing the cost of the housing to like 3 times what it would usually have been, which leads to displacement. So I guess the reason that I use that pattern is very simple, but I think it can help to provide some insight of like how it starts, like the documentation and the purposeful devaluation of property, and then it just starts this cycle all over again.
Yes. Hi, LaToya.
Hi.
Great job. Great presentation. The person in the front that was talking about Spencer Jones. Mr.
yeah.
Jones became the mayor of Fulton. We elected him the mayor
Yeah.
of Fulton. Probably before LaToya was born, and I was a young child, Fulton would constantly be under flood.
Oh.
Okay?
Yeah.
And a lot of those families kept moving back. They get flooded out, they move back. And I think Spencer's family was one of those families that would never leave the neighborhood.
Wow.
So he became, I think he has passed now, and before he died, they elected him the mayor of Fulton. And that area where in Fulton, guys in his community meet regularly. Still, it's a I don't know what, it's a trail park or something right now for kids using, I can't think of, BMX bikes. Yes, a BMX park. And so he is honored by the community on a regular basis because they still meet in his honor down there.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm so sorry I didn't answer that part of your question, so thank you, Robin. I appreciate that. Yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to bring to folks' attention that currently Richmond Redevelopment and Housing is being challenged by a tenants group on their removal of older structures and whether they're really providing adequately for space for people to move into. And also, does it even make sense that they're destroying those spaces? So that is certainly a way that at least people in the Richmond area can become involved in some way, supportive of those tenants. I think almost always the people who actually live somewhere are the ones who really understand what's going on and what it is that they would like to see, and that should be much more important than whatever plan somebody else might come up with.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for sharing that. Hi, Stephen.
Yeah, fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. Always learn something great. Yeah, the anatomy of erasure. What an illuminating framework. It just got my brain going all different kinds of ways. I guess, you know, how would you? There's so many continuities. The anatomy of erasure, as you documented it, still happening, obviously. But as you mentioned earlier, there's so many things that are different now about our housing market, about our politics than before. And so how would you update it for the current moment? Or, I mean, what are some continuities, some differences? As you mentioned, we have incredible amounts of outside investors, private equity in our system. We have this violent, efficient eviction system. We have a majority Democratic city that talks about equity, but, you know, continues displacement of African American and low-income folks in the city. So there's significant differences to before. And I love the are there any continuities that, I mean, I think there are a lot, but would you update it a little bit or add some things thinking about where we're at, especially with your deep involvement in Richmond 300? Yeah, just like, it's such a good framework. I love it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I just made that up like a few days ago. So there's always room for opportunity to update this. But I guess I just wanted something simplified because it is very complex and there are just so many nuances. So I don't want to make it overly simplified, but I just I guess I created that for this discussion and to hear from you, people like you, to hear what you have to say. But yeah, there's definitely opportunities to change it up.
Hi, thank you for your presentation today. So my curiosity was, you mentioned being a part of the Richmond 300. I remember attending a handful of those sessions as well.
Yes.
Oftentimes I notice that in participating in various civic engagement opportunities, I'm the youngest person in the room, so I'm just curious as to what might be your thoughts as to how to be more engaging with young people in, you know, civic opportunities such as like, you know, going to whether it's community meetings or charrettes about developments that are coming online, or you know, district meetings and so forth like that. More often than not, I see hundreds and thousands of people at protests, but I don't necessarily see folks at community meetings. And it could just be the ones I'm going to, but just curious.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I guess I will have to say, like, when I was participating in Richmond 300, I felt like it was definitely like learning, a crash course in learning, like a process I didn't know much about, and a language that people were well versed in, and I was just learning as I went along. So it can be very intimidating, I think. I think showing up matters a great deal, but I can see how it's intimidating and daunting. I will say there are a lot of great organizations across the city that are engaged in this work, that are plugged in, and I think there are efforts being made to like people to combine forces so that everyone's not working in silos. But I've seen an uptick in young people being interested, especially when it comes to, I think, the environmental justice component. Like there are a lot of young people who are tuned in to like what is happening in their community and how is it impacting them. And so I think that's been an entry point, often like with students that I engage with, like that's how they usually get plugged in. But it's a good question, and I think there are people out in the audience more knowledgeable or who are definitely more involved than I am at the moment on the ground who can speak to like different organizations that are doing this work and making it so that, you know, you're not alone and strategizing and whatnot. So that's a good question.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Very educational. I wanted to just make a comment about structures that did survive
Yes, sir.
the highway. And I'm speaking specifically of the 6 Mount Zion Baptist Church
Yes.
in downtown Jackson Ward. The highway came through during the 1950s. Hundreds of structures were demolished. However, the Six Mount Zion Baptist Church survived. And I think it's a very good case study to wonder, well, how did it survive? What was it about that church that survived and everything all around it was demolished? Its history
Yes.
is what saved it. And I think when we have these discussions today about the Cultural Heritage Stewardship Plan, for example, that we make sure that our structures that we cherish, their histories are well documented, well supported, so that if something should threaten them, that the history would be something to help them survive.
Yes. Amen. Yeah, that's perfect. I don't have anything to add to that. Thank you.
Hey, like the last person, I have something I just wanted to share with the audience here. Is I've been exposed a little bit to the redevelopment that's currently happening in Richmond, and one thing to know is that the state legislature passed a law that allows the city council to have special use permits, and the planning commission is built of almost entirely real estate development insiders, and they rubber stamp just about everything with no real analysis. I believe that it's vitally important that the state remove this opportunity for these people to pass special use permits, and they also need to revisit the members of this committee so it's not real estate insiders and people who profit from development within the city, so that Richmonders can actually decide Richmond's future.
Yeah. Thank you. Well stated.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm sorry I had to miss the first little bit of it, but I'm going to refer to a bit of recent reporting by, I think, WTVR. So if you spoke to this in the early part of your talk, forgive me, but I'd like your thoughts on it. So recently, WTVR, I think, disclosed that the city of Richmond was losing out on a certain amount of property tax from, I think it was in the millions, from various properties around the city, and many of them were blighted, abandoned. I don't know if all of them were, or even most, and that during the Mayor Stoney's administration, they were being put up to auction. That had come to a pause, and Mayor, Avula is considering starting that up again. Anyway, but this bit of reporting came in the context of recent conversations around the city about the property tax rate for the city being higher, significantly higher than the counties, and being too high, et cetera, particularly given the services. And it also comes in the context of this historical criticism by Richmond residents and at the state level too, of Richmond leadership, which is problematic. So I'm thinking about who owned these properties, who's buying these properties up during these auctions, what's happening, like were they constant? If you have any information, I'd love to know about it. I didn't see it in this series of reporting, but I'm thinking about also how that type of conversation as it came out in the news would have benefited greatly from a type of historical lens that wasn't present there. So it's a bit of a comment, but if you have anything more to add about that process underway in the city, I would love to hear it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good comment and question. Again, I think there was one slide I wanted to include, and I forgot to do so, that focused on a property in Church Hill that is in what was a formerly red line area. And so, like, you can look at property records, I guess, to find this information, but it was just stunning. And I've shared this slide with others before, where the property was valued pretty low by the city, like around $10,000 or something like that, and then purchased, it went into foreclosure, sadly, I think, and then purchased by an investor, and then you know, gussied up or rehabbed and now sold like at an astronomical value within that neighborhood. I don't know, it's just, I think personally as someone who loves history and who is finding out more and more about communities that existed that I didn't realize existed, I think like just being interested in that history and really digging deeper into like the historical geography of a space is just pertinent, I think, for our city leaders, planners. Often urban planners will look at like the last 20 years of a space and that's it. They don't go further back, to my chagrin. But I mean, I think like it starts with people who are professionals in these positions, like making the effort to find out like the whole history of a space and then helping, I guess, to drive policy and change that's equitable and takes into account like historical racism. I mean, 'cause often that's what it was. So I'm not sure if that answers your question or not. I think about that a lot, though. Like, what responsibility do we have? Like, now that we know better, we have to do better, right? So I don't have anything else to add to that for right now. But yeah, that's a very good thought to think about. So thank you.
Thank you, LaToya. The article that she was referencing is the WRIC Channel 8. It was talking about the city requiring us owed about $33 million worth of property taxes that haven't been paid in the last 10 to 15 years. And some of them, they can't even get the money back. It's a long story and long reporting. We are getting ready to take a break and prepare for our last session that will start at 2:45, I do believe. Thank you.
Thank you.